Good evening. Welcome to our special class tonight for the Battleground class. And each week we have a guest speaker, and as you can tell, because we're meeting here and we've done extended invitations to folks, tonight is very special. And for those of you who haven't been a part of this class before, instead of my reading Mr. Smith's resume, which will take the entire time we have tonight, what I do is, and I will do it now, is to ask him to basically introduce himself and let him talk about himself, and I'll interrupt every once in a while, but I'll give you a lead-in. I know you were born in Scotland.
It's true.
Your Honor.
You didn't ask me why or how. I don't care about any of that stuff.
I care, but I don't know that. Do you think it's relevant? Tell us why.
I was born in Scotland of a couple of American parents, and it's relevant to why I'm here today because my parents lived in Europe for the next 7 years, and I grew up in Europe. And we moved when I was at the grand old age of 2 to Freiburg, Germany. At the time, Hitler was rising in Germany. And my parents went home to tell people in America that danger was rising in Europe, and of course Americans paid no attention to that. And then my family moved outside of Barcelona in Spain at the time of the Spanish Civil War, and we went through that period. And then we moved back to Britain, to London, and to a place called Chesham in Buckinghamshire, and I remember the beginning of World War II with the air raids in England, and actually I remember hearing the King's speech as a kid of 6 years old. I remember that speech that was part of the movie. And that's important to my life because my parents were in love with the years they spent in Europe, and I grew up thinking that I should be traveling, and I think that had a great deal to do with my becoming a foreign correspondent.
Tell us why your parents were in Europe to begin with.
Right. My father was there on business. He was a graduate of the University of, can I say it in Ohio, University of Michigan.
You said it.
And he was sent over there as a management consultant, a 1920s, 30s McKinsey company. So that was one thing that got me started. Then I bounced around a bunch of different schools and whatnot. And when I was in high school, I read the autobiographies of a couple of the great muckraker journalists, Lincoln Steffens and William Allen White. And I fell in love with journalism and the idea that journalists could actually have an important impact on the politics of the country, at that time meaning the progressive era. And I have a hunch we might be involved in another progressive era now, but maybe that's being too hopeful. So those two things were important. And today, believe it or not, I'm about to launch a website on www.reclaimtheamericandream.org, which is about encouraging people to get involved in civic action at the grassroots and offering them all kinds of examples, success stories, progress reports, which flow out of that kind of journalistic reading. So it's interesting, biography actually does matter.
So when you came back to this country, where did you settle and where did you go to school?
Well, where we settled was Detroit, Michigan, because that's where my dad was from. And his father had a small envelope company. In fact, the reason we came back to America was that his father had a heart attack and died and fairly rapidly, and my father was the only child. We had bedded down in England for the war. We were not coming home. And because of that, we got out on the last 2 boats from Europe, from England, and I can remember the U-boat drills and the excitement that caused. You know, as a 6-year-old kid, I thought that was really exciting. I wasn't terrified. I remember learning how to count the steps. I came back with my grandmother, count the steps from our stateroom down, I don't know, 3 or 4 decks down, all the way up in the dark to our lifeboat with our life jackets on and stuff. And I kept peering over the railing to see if I could see a conning tower. I really wanted to see the real thing. It was so I came back, went to school in Detroit, Michigan for the first couple of. It's interesting. I had been to what I thought was a farm school. We fed the animals and so forth at first grade in England. And when I got back to America, they wanted to jump me 2 grades. And my parents wouldn't allow that to happen. They just jumped me 1 grade. And from this sort of nothing English school when I came back to to Detroit, and you'll be very happy to know in Cleveland I became a Detroit Tigers fan at that point, and I've been one ever since, and it has not been one of the happiest experiences of my life.
Try the Indians.
But yeah, I mean, the Indians, we just all learned to hate the Yankees together, right? Anyway, so I did that, but before you knew it, we were living in Utica, New York, and Darien, Connecticut, and Greenville, South Carolina. My father just kept moving around with business, and I jumped around with it. And I really think that vagabond life, but the intellectual stimulus of the interaction with other cultures was something that was deeply embedded in my life from the very beginning. And I think it really had a very important role in the dream I had at one point of becoming a foreign correspondent.
Why Williams College? You wound up at Williams College. Why Williams?
You know, it's an uncanny thing that you ask these innocent questions and you wind up by touching something very important. I was never headed to be a journalist. When I got out of high school, I was the top science and math student in my school. I happened to go to Choate School, the same school as the Kennedys went to. And I was about to head off to MIT. And the director of studies said, you know, there's more to you than science and math. He said, you should think about doing something different. You can go to Amherst or Williams or Middlebury or Bowdoin or one of those colleges, take 3 years in a liberal arts school and 2 years at MIT and get both a BA and a BS from both of those schools. And he said, I would suggest you do that. Now, I was also running the student newspaper at that time, and I wasn't bad at English, so he had some, but I'm indebted to that man. I mean, I went to Williams, and I did the integral calculus and the introduction to chemistry and physics and that kind of stuff. And I took extra courses because I was so interested. I took American history and European history and literature. And I just got so turned on by the liberal arts courses that I dropped the whole idea of going to MIT, majored in American history and lit, and kind of the rest is history. I mean, I was on a liberal arts track at that point. So the openness of a liberal arts education and the importance of the 4 years of being in a campus like yours or a campus like mine, Williams, is so important for young people to be able to explore themselves, to be exposed to good faculty like yourselves, that I'm just indebted to the people who had a role in that.
Well, we have something in common. I have a BA degree in American history also, but I had mine from the Proletariat's Harvard, which was a city college in New York. So I know what I did with my history degree. What did you do with your history degree?
You know, it's interesting. I went on to Oxford. It's one thing I did, but then I went into the Air Force. But eventually, the study of American history and American philosophy and American religion and American art and American culture actually trained me beautifully to become the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times years later, because I took the culture in as a whole. And I think the reason I wrote a book that was important to a lot of people about Russia was because of the kind of broad study of American culture that I got at Williams, and I just applied it. And one of the great kicks of my life was that one of my professors took my book about Russia, the Russians, and he used it to start the American history and lit major at Williams College 25 or 30 years later, because he was trying to show the students there the study of culture and how one of his students had gone on and done this, and looking and studying Russia helped them to turn around and look and study America.
Was James McGregor Burns there when you were there?
He was there when I was there, but that's not the guy who did it. It was a historian named Fred Rudolph, who was a great historian of American history. Anyway, so these things come around. I mean, so what I did with the study of history is essentially build the kind of journalistic career that I've had, which is one that looks at cultures, looks at systems, tries to understand how people think, how they operate, why people are different from each other, and how we can understand each other.
But you didn't go, was your first job at the New York Times, or did you have to go someplace else to begin with?
I went to the New York Times looking for a job when I came out of the Air Force. And when I came out of the Air Force, I actually was working for Air Intelligence, and I'd been assigned to the CIA. And I went to see Scotty Reston, who was then running the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. And I had put in a couple of summers as a student at Williams and at Choate as a cub reporter at the Greenville, South Carolina News, where my family lived. So I went into Reston. Somehow, I don't even know how the heck I got in to see Reston. with that kind of resume. But anyway, he agreed to see me, and he was very nice. And he said, and I had a bunch of other job offers, which he talked to me about. And he said, Smith, he said, you got to play some minor league ball. He said, you got to go play ball in Akron or the Pony League down in Texas or Beaumont or something like that. And then come back and see me. So that's what I did. I took a job with United Press in Memphis, Tennessee. And I was lucky enough to be in Nashville, Tennessee in February 1960 when the sit-ins began, the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement in Nashville and in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the story took off. And I mean, I just got in on a huge national story just by luck. So I'd go back to Reston every year. I'd send him my clippings and that kind of stuff. He said, "I'm Casey Stengel. I'm not going to hire you. You know, you got to learn how to swing the bat. You know, you got to knock the mud out of your cleats." And so I finally went back 2 or 3 times and sent him clippings. I got some experience, and lo and behold, one day, you're going to get it now because you asked these kinds of questions. I was learning how to dance on figure skates with my wife at a skating arena in Atlanta, Georgia, if you can believe it. And a phone call comes in from Reston, and he says he wants to meet me at the Atlanta airport. Well, I come out to meet him. So I came out to meet Reston, and you know, within a month or so, I was hired to work for the New York Times and the Washington Bureau.
And so this was, you know, you did do your
I did 3 years,
stuff.
which is not exactly a lot of minor league ball, but anyway.
And I've lived in each one of those places you talked about for different reasons, but leave that alone. Okay, so you come to the New York Times in Washington. What's your first beat?
The first thing you do at the New York Times at that time is you go to New York, because I was hired in Washington, and there was a political fight between New York and Washington over the control of the paper and so forth, and it was deemed in New York that Reston had his own barony and satrapy down in Washington, and so they wanted to propagandize and inculcate the new hires of the Washington Bureau in New York. So you had to go spend 3 months in New York learning about the News of the Week in Review and the magazine and the foreign desk and the city desk and the national desk, no. So I took 1 week up there, and the second week I was getting ready to get on the plane to go to New York, and they called me up and they said, Claude Sitton is in Albany, Georgia, and Martin Luther King is down there leading a demonstration, and it looks like John Meredith is going to get into the University of Mississippi, and so we need to send Sitton over to Mississippi to cover that story, and we need you to go right away to Albany, Georgia, and see Sitton because he's leaving tomorrow. So instead of taking a plane to New York, I took a plane to Atlanta, and then I got to Albany, Georgia. At that point, I didn't even know the telephone number of the New York Times, really. And you dictated your stories into the New York Times at that point. But they said, go get one of those beat-up Olivettis in the Washington Bureau. That's what I had, an Olivetti typewriter. I never went home that whole summer. I spent 3 months on the road. I mean, I was in Albany, Georgia, and I was over in Jackson. Sitton was up in Ole Miss. I was in Jackson. I was at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals at New Orleans. I went to Winston-Salem. I went all over the South. I was at the schoolhouse door with George Corley Wallace when they desegregated the University of Alabama. It just went on. When I came home, one of my kids sort of looked at me as if I was a stranger. I mean, I literally disappeared for 3 months, period, just like that. I mean, and I left to go somewhere. I thought I was going for 2 or 3 days or a week.
Oh, but that was, did you know at that point what you were covering? I mean, did you have a sense of that?
Well, the reason why the New York Times sent me back there was they knew I'd worked for United Press International. I'd covered the civil rights movement in Tennessee and in Georgia, and they'd have trouble with some reporters going to the South and getting in fights with Southern sheriffs and not getting the story and so forth. So they wanted somebody who could get into town, get out of town, do a good job, be able to go back, have sources, build sources. They knew I could do that. So, I mean, I literally within about 3 or 4 days of joining the paper, I had the lead story in the paper, you know, which in a paper like the New York Times is just unheard of. It just broke that way.
Well, I don't know, before we leave this, I want to go back a second because of the technology of today. You mentioned that you didn't know the phone number of the New York Times, you had to call in your story. Did calling your story mean you wrote it and you read it over the phone?
Yes. Yeah, yes, only what happened was that when I was working, this is very important. What happened was when I was working for United Press in Nashville, I also covered the state government, and I would cover the state legislature, okay? And it was a wire service, so in a wire service you need to file your story fast to be competitive. And so I learned how to listen to hearings and listen to debate and walk out without ever writing my story and just dictate a story, paragraph by paragraph, into the phone. I learned to do that at United Press. They discovered at the New York Times I could do that, so they sent me to New Orleans to cover the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is in a later time zone. And often the court ruled in the afternoon, so I could walk out of that hearing at like 6 or 6:15 and have a finished story into the dictation room at the New York Times, by 7 or 7:15, which made the deadline. So that was an important part of the, just the journalistic technique. I mean, it's totally different today. You don't do that, but yeah, I mean, we would write stories and type them up and then call them in. But as I'm saying, and the same thing happened. I mean, the night the riot happened in Birmingham, I mean, I didn't write the story. I mean, I'm in a phone booth dictating paragraphs to the editors in New York, and they're stitching the story together. And then you've got rewrites going on all night long. There's no paper, you don't have a paper copy of it to keep track of it.
And were you able to see your story the next day in the Times, or was the Times available to even read what some of the places you were at?
Yeah. But the difficulty was that the version you could see was always the early edition, because it's called the Bulldog edition. The early edition, the deadline was very early, and then events would often go on, long into the night, and you'd get a later edition, and those would be, for New York and Washington, and then eventually just for New York and Connecticut and northern New Jersey, and then eventually just for the New York Public Library and the New York Times, at 3 o'clock in the morning.
But was the Times at that point
yes
as national as it is today?
No, it wasn't as national as it is today. It was available, but with delay, and very quickly after that, 63, 64, the Times began printing satellite editions around the country. So it was going in that direction, but when I joined it, it wasn't quite as national.
So this work you did on the civil rights movement, especially the Times, was that your first Pulitzer? Did you get a Pulitzer?
No, I didn't get it. No, Claude Sitton deserved the Pulitzer. Claude Sitton won a Pulitzer years later. Claude Sitton was a marvelous reporter. Yeah, I was young. I mean, I was just brand new at the Times. I mean, the amount of journalistic experience I had was fairly limited. 3 or 4 years professional experience. Yeah, it didn't mean I couldn't cover the stories, but I wasn't writing the quality of story that Sitton was. I mean, Sitton had been covering the South for years. He really knew the region. It's not just covering the events. It's the depth. It's the understanding. It's the history. It's the context that you're adding into the coverage, which makes it rich. When I got to Moscow, I was finally doing that myself. When I was working out of Cairo, I was doing that. But it takes a while to get that kind of skill.
Well, as a reporter for the New York Times, was there something about that it was the New York Times as opposed to being UPI, as opposed to being the Greenville paper? I mean, was there something, that not that you wrote any differently, but there was something, you read the New York Times, you weren't at the UPI anymore.
Yeah, the New York Times wanted more color, more depth, more context, and they would give you more space. Let me tell you a story about Birmingham. I was in Birmingham in 1963. Martin Luther King was demonstrating there and so forth. And it was after Harrison Salisbury had written the famous stories about Birmingham, Alabama as a city of fear. And the city commissioners in Birmingham filed a libel suit against the New York Times, which was then being heard in the courts. It was working its way through the courts. When I went back, and Harrison Salisbury at that point was my boss. He was the national editor. He was the guy who'd sent me to Birmingham. So I'm wandering around Birmingham, and Harrison Salisbury is asking me, what are they saying down there? What are they talking about the Times and one thing and another? And so one afternoon, it is tense. You just can feel the tension. The blacks have been demonstrating downtown. The fire hoses have been out. The dogs have been released on the kids. And Bull Connor, who was the city police commissioner, a real tough segregationist down in Birmingham, had asked for Al Lingo, the head of the Alabama State Highway Patrol, to bring in 400 state troopers into the city of Birmingham because he was afraid that the city was going to blow. And there was a park in the middle of the black part of town, and I wanted to go over to talk to Connor and Lingo, well, not exactly friendly guys, about how many cops there were and I needed some quotes from their side as to what was going on. And so I went over there with a reporter with two other reporters. And we get over there, and Bull Connor's sitting down in a folding chair, and Lingo's standing by, Lingo in his blue uniform and his yellow hard hat, and they're lounging around with a bunch of cops around him and so forth. And I start asking questions. And Connor looks at me and says, "Where y'all boys from?" And I didn't say anything. And the guy next to me said, "I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I'm from the Melbourne Age." And Connor said to him, "Well, you better write nice about us. You better not write bad things about America in that paper of yours over there in Australia. We'll come and get you, you know. You better be good to us." And he said, "Where are you from?" And the next guy next to me said, "I'm from Newsday in Long Island." He said, "You're one of those Yankee reporters come down here and write bad stuff about Birmingham." He said, "You're doing this stuff. You guys are terrible. I'm not talking to you guys. Where are you from?" He said to me. And I said, "I'm from the New York Times." "Oh," he said, "boy, you're from the New York Times?" He said, "I got me a big lawsuit against you with the New York Times." He said, "I will win that lawsuit, and you're going to be working for me." And I said, "How about a raise?" And he broke out laughing, and he said, "You're all right, you're a good old boy." I said, "What do you want?" And so that's how it went.
What kind of experiences, before we leave this, did you have with Dr. King?
Well, I can't tell you how many times I heard him and saw him speak, come into towns where people had been demoralized and beaten up. I've been in so many churches in Birmingham and Gadsden and Albany, Georgia, and up in northeastern Georgia and smaller towns. Watched him kind of rally and lift people, give them moral courage. He would say again and again, "Children, don't you get weary. It's a long march to Jerusalem. It's a long way to go, but we shall overcome." And then they would sing the song, "We Shall Overcome." One of the interesting things he said, and I was at the March on Washington, and people remember that, of course, for the wonderful, soaring, anguished rhetoric of his writing. "I have a dream, that one day America will fulfill its promise that my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the character, the crystal clearness of their character." And I think what people forget is that there were times when King walked the walk. He didn't just talk the talk. And when people recall King today, they sort of recall him at that March on Washington moment on the pedestal in front of that great temple of American democracy, the Lincoln Memorial, with Lincoln hands on the chair looking down on you. But he put on his coveralls. He didn't do it a lot, but he did go out. He did get arrested at times when he thought it was strategic for the movement. There were a lot of younger blacks who didn't think he did it enough. They used to mock him. They called him the Lord. The younger guys in SNCC, they would say, "Here comes the Lord. He's going to come in at the right moment, the last moment." He wasn't there, if you remember, at Selma on the day of the Bloody Sunday, the Bad March. So the younger ones mocked him. But King did walk the walk, and he was not only inspiring, but he was canny at times too. And I remember many towns I went into in the South where people talked about him as an outside agitator. "What are you doing coming into our town?" It's kind of like Bull Connor talking to us. You're coming down here to badmouth Birmingham. And they would call him an outside agitator. You come in and stir up our people. Our people are all right. Our blacks, our Negroes are all right. They're happy, they're content. You don't stir them up, you're an outside agitator. And King was very smart. Instead of denying that, he said, "Yes." He said, "I am an agitator." He said, "Look inside your washing machine. There's an agitator in there agitating the water and the soap and knocking the dirt out of your clothes." He said, "I'm an agitator, and I'm coming here, and I'm agitating the dirt out of our society. Segregation, Jim Crow, racism." So, I mean, he was approachable, but he was special. And I think people forget, but there was a really talented group of black leaders around King. I mean, guys like Andy Young, Reverend Vivian Abernathy, there was a whole team of them, and then there was a whole core of SNCC people, John Lewis and some of the younger people. It was an impressive group of leaders, and today I talk to people about the need for civic action, the need for Americans in the middle class to get re-engaged, and everybody says, where's the leader going to come from? Where's the next Martin Luther King going to come from? Where's the next Abraham Lincoln going to come from? And my answer to that is going to come from below. Really good leadership in a democracy actually comes from below. And that's what happened to King, and that's what happened to these others. You know, look at John Lewis. He's been in Congress for years. I mean, he was just a student who got fed up, who thought the Supreme Court decision in 1954 meant that he, as a kid who grew up in the Black Belt of Alabama, could go to a desegregated high school in a town where it was almost impossible for blacks to walk on the same side of the street with a lot of white adults, certainly the sheriff and the police. And when that didn't happen, he said, hey, this promise has not been fulfilled. So I watched leaders actually emerge. I covered them, and that's part of what the Times wanted you to do, was to write about the people you were talking to, not just about the events. So it was a great experience for me. I mean, because it was a period of enormous change. And people think of it as a period of protest and a period of anger. And it's relevant to today because we're an angry country today. A lot of people are angry. A lot of people think the political system is broken. But it was also a period of immense idealism. Idealism because the people who were walking the streets, Martin Luther King and the rest of those people said, we can make America better by demanding from America that it fulfill its promise to us. A great thing. Think about it. That is what's made America great. It's happened through generation after generation. You know, Missouri Compromise, Civil War, you know, on through New Deal, all kinds of other periods. The progressive era that I was referring to before. So I think that era and that coverage affected me, and it affects me today. And here we are, 1960s, here we are 50 years later. And I'm still affected by that optimism, by that spirit that America can do better. But the recognition that it won't do better unless we do it. We cannot wait for the people in the political system, the people who've been elected to office in Congress, in the White House, and elsewhere to do it. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the consumer movement, the labor movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, all those movements in that period of the 60s and 70s had an enormous impact on public policy because ordinary people had the confidence that they could go take action and express themselves by physically going and demonstrating and objecting to conditions they regarded as unacceptable. And that's something that you hear a little bit of today, but we've lost our nerve as a people. We've lost our faith in ourselves.
I want to spend some time on follow up on that. But before we get to that, I want to fill in here on let's talk a little bit about going to Moscow and you know what it was like when you went there and what Russia is like today. What's the kind of differences are there between when you were there and when you wrote the book and what's going on today?
Well, in the first place, if you look at the country from the outside, in some ways it looks the same, but inside it's really different. I mean, when I went there, it was a communist dictatorship in which people were afraid to say what they thought to their neighbors, and sometimes members of their own family. I mean, I knew Boris Pasternak's oldest son and his family, Zhenya Pasternak. And I'll never forget one evening, my wife and I were having supper at their house, their apartment in downtown Moscow. And he was telling me that his son, Borya, was now 14 or 15. And he wondered whether or not he could tell Borya the truth about what he believed and what he thought. That all the years of that kid growing up, the parents had been very careful not to reveal their ideas because the kids in Russia and that part of that Soviet Russia were told to tell on their parents. So it was risky. If you go to a family like that today, and I haven't been to Russia in a decade or so, so I better be careful, but I'm pretty sure from talking to people I know, That's simply not true today. Now, whether or not you can go out in the streets and you can organize an opposition party and so on, no, they're going to, and they just had the assassination of this guy Boris Nemtsov. So it's risky for people to fight Putin openly and so forth. And it is a dictatorship now. But the kind of thought control there was then, I don't think it carries on now. But Putin has, Gorbachev really opened it up, and Yeltsin. And Putin and his people have really put the lid back down on opposition parties, on a free press, a relatively free press, on the kind of travel people can do abroad. But people who are well off, people who are professional people, people in scientific institutes and that kind of thing, they still can travel abroad. They still have a greater sense of freedom, at least the ones that get out that I talk to when they come to this country, than people did. It was just not possible to do when I was there. Now, Russia, the country, as we confront it and look at it, we're seeing Russian nationalism at work in Eastern Europe today, in the Ukraine, exercised more carefully than Brezhnev did when he sent the tanks and suppressed the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. But we're seeing the Russia that's been there for the last 2.5 or 3 centuries, where the czars, as well as the commissars, and as well as Putin, regarded that area around them in Eastern Europe the same way we regard the Caribbean. It's our territory. It's our sphere of influence. Don't you come in here, or we're going to run you out. And we take it for granted. For us, it's okay. If the Russians do that, we think it's unfair. It's the way great powers behave, I learned. But so in that sense, what we're seeing is a playing out of an old historical theme in Russia. But the personal stories, I think, are different. What's interesting is the power of culture, the power of history. The communists actually grafted on their system onto a Russian system of absolutism and dictatorship. And it existed before it hit us coming out the other side. And we saw it all as communism, and it was a threat to us because it was global and because they had nuclear weapons. But a lot of that wasn't really communism. That was Russian nationalism operating with communism as its foreign policy troops out there in the world. So they could cause trouble in Vietnam, they could cause trouble in Angola and Africa, they could move into Cuba and so forth. But that was Russians asserting their power as a great power. So in that sense, not a lot has changed.
No, were you in Cairo before Moscow or Cairo after?
Before, yeah.
And was that your first overseas
No,
assignment?
Saigon was my first.
So you covered the war in Saigon?
Yeah.
What was that like?
Scary. It's scary to cover war. Now, I covered the war before we had massive troops there. At the time I was there, we had quote advisors, right? 23,000 people. Well, I can tell you, sitting in a helicopter that's doing evasive action while they're supporting a land operation by the South Vietnamese Army, and people are shooting at you, it feels like war, even if it's only an advisory action. I found it fascinating because it was. I understood it. I had the opportunity because there was so still 23,000 troops. It was a political war. That was always a political war. And the danger we get into is when we start to commit large number of troops, we think they're military wars. That was a political war. We lost that war because we lost the politics of the war, both inside Vietnam and at home. And we did it because we really didn't understand how Vietnamese culture operates. And we didn't understand that our real enemy was Vietnamese nationalism, which was much more powerful than our alliance and our weapons and our advisors and all our military firepower.
Well, give us an idea of what a day was like for you in what was a war zone.
Well, the war zone was all around you, but it wasn't like there were battlefronts and lines. What was going on at the time I was there were the elements of the Viet Cong were massing and attacking guardhouses and hamlets and units of the Vietnamese army, and then fading into the bush, then hiding away. So I would be in Saigon, and I would hear something was going on, and then I'd find out if I could hitch a helicopter ride on a military plane, or get in some jeeps to go down the main highway into the Mekong Delta to Kanto or Mito or the towns down there, or I'd go up to Tai Ninh in the area northwest of Saigon, where there was a certain amount of fighting going on. It's kind of a hopscotch, a grasshopper kind of war. It's not like war the way World War II was, where you have a front and there's a line. If you're sitting at home, you can move the flags forward or move them backwards or that kind of stuff. It was completely different. It's like dealing with a flight of mosquitoes. They're biting you here and biting you there and biting you here, and you know, where the hell are they, right? That's how it was. And what happened was, I succeeded David Halberstam in Vietnam, and Halberstam had set up a relationship with Neo Sheehan. Sheehan was the UPI bureau chief. As a wire service bureau chief operating alone, Sheehan could not afford to leave Saigon in case something important happened in Saigon. And so what would happen was Halberstam would go out in the country, and when I took his place, I would go out in the country and travel to these parts of particularly Mekong Delta was where a lot of the fighting was going on then, and go down and talk to people and try to see what had happened and put the pieces together and tell a story and whatnot. And to come back, and I would share my notes with Sheehan, and then Sheehan would tell me what the heck had been going on in Saigon during the day, and he would share his notes with me, and I'd decide whether or not I had to file 2 stories or 1 story to the New York Times. And then there was a coup, an interesting way you live. I inherited a house from Halberstam, and I happened to live in the same house with Horst Voss, who was famous German photographer, AP, for Associated Press, the rival of UPI. And I shared the bathroom with Horst and his mistress, his German mistress. It was just interesting. And one morning, I was sleeping under my mosquito netting, and I hear the door banging. And it's Malcolm Brown, who was the bureau chief of the AP at that time. And he's banging on Horst's bedroom door and say, "Horst, get up, there are tanks in the street. Get up, there are tanks in the street." And I can hear tanks in the street, tanks in the street. So I get up, I get dressed, and I go downstairs, and I head for Tudo Street, which is where Rue Cadenat, the French call it, Tudo Street, where Sheehan had his office, to alert Sheehan. And Sheehan slept behind his office, or he slept in the same building, maybe upstairs or behind it, can't remember. Anyway, and while I'm going in to town to see him, and I get a pedicab, I get one of these guys with a bicycle who's taking me into town, and we go by, it doesn't mean anything to anybody else, but we go by Big Min's house. Duong Ban Min was the head of the coup that overthrew Ngo Dinh Diem. So he was the head of the government. Okay? He's in charge of the military junta that is running Saigon, running Vietnam at that point. And as I go by, I see all the tanks around his house. Guess what? Instead of the guns being pointed out, they're pointed in. So I figured Duong Ban Min has just been overthrown. Okay? You know, somebody quoted you, "Hey, Duong Ban Min's been overthrown." No, you don't get stories handed to you that way in that kind of situation. So I go in to tell Sheehan about it, so the two of us can start working our sources together. And I don't know what time it is. It's 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. It's early. And so we go to work, and sure enough, there was another coup underway. There was a guy named Nguyen Khan had overthrown him. And in fact, Duong Ban Min was under arrest, which we got confirmed later on in the day. But I mean, that's sort of what it was like.
Did you know at the time that colleagues like Sheehan and Halberstam could become, you know, icons? I mean, I don't know if they were then, but they certainly have been.
No, I mean, you were doing your job. I mean, do we know yeah, I mean, the press corps at that point, and I was part of that, but I came later than they did, and I didn't stay as long. But the press corps was in a vehement argument with the American military about the way the war was going. And so you didn't think of yourself as an icon, but you knew you were on a battle line. And I mean, if you begin to understand how power works, you begin to understand that you're not an innocent in these things, and you have to be careful. I mean, for example, I remember when Henry Cabot Lodge became the ambassador there. And, you know, as a good New York Times reporter, I want to go in and interview Henry Cabot Lodge, the ambassador, as he takes over and what he thinks about things. And I forget, I didn't see him right away, but I saw him a couple of weeks later, whatever. And I go in there, and he tells me a whole bunch of stuff about how bad the situation is in the Mekong Delta, which is counter to what the military's been saying, right? And I've just been handed one hell of a good story, right? So I write it up. Goes back, it's on the front page of the New York Times. It dawns on me a day or two later that Lodge wanted to get that message to Kennedy, and if you sent it in a cable through the State Department, the president might or might not see it, but it would be delayed 2 or 3 days. But if he gave it to Smith of the New York Times, the president would read it the next morning. So you began to understand your role there. And so you have to be careful whether or not somebody's taking you or not taking you. But and it was a good story. And what was going on was Lodge was setting a low standard for when he took over. I inherited a really messed up situation. So he's admitting how bad it was, so that if it gets better, he can claim it got better. So he's laying down his baseline. That's what he was doing with me. And then he did another couple of interviews after it. So, that helped me when I got back to Washington, because you begin to understand how politicians are using the media and so forth, and you have to figure out, where you fit, where you're doing your job right, where you're serving your readers, and you're not letting people use you. And none of us are good enough to avoid being used from time to time. It happens.
Now, you left the Times.
I don't think we're going to get done tonight.
No, it will be. They brought their overnight stuff. So did you. You leave the Times to write books, or because your second career, when I go to second or third career, has been very successful in writing a number of very best-selling books. But why just have enough of being a reporter?
No. I mean, we've left that, some of the Moscow stuff and so forth. No, I was in the running to become the executive editor of the New York Times. I was one of 4 or 5 people they were looking at, okay? And they picked Max Frankel. It was a very good choice. But Max is about 5 years older than I was. And so I knew if Max was picked, there was no chance in the world that I was going to be the next guy. The next guy was going to be 5 years younger than I was, right? And I was right, it was Joe Lelyveld. Okay, so that was something I had my eye on. I thought, that's not going to happen. And I had taken a leave from the Times to write The Russians, and then I took another leave from the Times to write The Power Game, How Washington Works. And what happened was somebody came to me and said, there's an opportunity to make television out of that book. It's a complicated story, I'm not going to go through it. ABC had tried to hire me to work for its documentary unit. I didn't want to leave the New York Times at that point when I had been running the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. But I had started to think about television documentaries as a new way to report. I've been doing daily journalism for 30 years, and I had a wonderful time. And I suddenly, I've written 2 books. They were both very successful. And I thought, geez, here's another way to express myself. There's another way to communicate with people. And so it's a really interesting story, but too complicated to tell now. So I got into that. I had an opportunity to turn my own reporting for the Power Game into a 4-hour documentary series. And when I got done with that, then Gorbachev comes along, and I got a chance to go to Russia, do another documentary series on Perestroika, and then another one after that. The next thing you know, I'm in a new career.
And the success of the books, how do you decide? I want to really talk about your latest book, which, by the way, is still available to be purchased. And we have here, if anybody wants to purchase a book online or whatever, Mr. Smith will sign for you, autograph your book before you get it, so keep that in mind.
Or if you got one out,
you got one.
It's a bookplate you can paste in your book.
How do you decide? Obviously the Russian thing, you were in Moscow, and that makes sense. But the latest book seems to have, not that your other books you weren't as passionate about, but you're really passionate about this book and what you're trying to convey in this book, because you're basically trying to convey action. You're trying to get people to get involved. So,
right.
But what happened in this country? What happened to move you to write this kind of book?
Well, what happened was that over the years doing PBS documentaries for Frontline and others, I did one called The Wall Street Fix. The interplay between large corporations and Wall Street banks. I did one on Can You Afford to Retire, about whether or not middle-class people could save enough money under 401k plans to be able to retire. I did one called Tax Me If You Can, which was about the tax evasion schemes of major corporations and wealthy people. I did several of these economic, social kind of documentaries that got me deeper and deeper into the way the American economy and the American society was working. And I was doing a documentary, a 2-hour documentary program for Frontline on the environment when the housing bubble burst. And David Fanning, the executive producer of Frontline, said to me, you gotta stop doing what you're doing and go cover the housing bubble and do us a documentary on the housing bubble. And I said, David, I can't do it. I've raised money from people. They're expecting this environmental documentary to come out. I'll do it when I get done. Well, when I got done with that one, I went and looked at the housing crisis, and I went back to Fanning. I said, you want to do a documentary on the housing crisis now? He said, oh, no. He said, the housing crisis is over. I said, David, I don't think you're right. I think it's going to get worse. And I think at that point it was the subprime crisis we were talking about. I said, I think it's going to get worse, and let me go do a couple of months of reporting on this, and I'll come back to you. And I came back to him, I said, David, it's not a subprime crisis. This is now mainstream, middle-class America. Families are getting foreclosed out of their homes. This is going to have an enormous impact. This is 2009. And it isn't just a Wall Street collapse. This is going to ripple. This is going to go on for quite a while. This is a really bad situation. And David disagreed with me. And I said, all right, screw it. Maybe it's time for me to write another book. Because what had happened was I was beginning to see the same. I'd never written anything about banks, deeply about the banks and about housing. And I was beginning to see the same patterns in the housing crisis that I'd seen in the shipping of jobs overseas, in the industrial area, and the retirement problem, and the tax situation. So I said, you know, to me a book is a time when you're trying to pull things together. It isn't, I mean, other people write different books, and they're great books, but they're about, you know, a sliver of a story or a highly focused story. I'm one of those guys who likes to try to understand and explain a whole situation. And so I needed to do it. I just needed to understand it for myself. And I literally took, fortunately I had a publisher that was willing to give me an advance, or I could have afforded to do this, but I literally took a whole year off. I stopped for a year. I didn't write at all. And I did a year's worth of reporting and research until I finally started to put this book together. And then it took me another 1.5 years to write the book. And I just was convinced that this was an enormous story, and that it was a story of great significance, and that we were going through not just a trauma, but we were going through a period of potentially fatal change in our economy and the way our political system was operating. And so the book kind of gave me, it's very much like the Russians. And at one point I almost thought about calling the book The Americans, because it's kind of like the Russians. It's an effort to pull it all together and explain it and tell it in stories, in human stories. So I don't know. You know, it was an instinctive journalist. I mean, there's part of what makes good journalists, part of what makes good editors, part of what makes good producers. There's a moment when you sense this is the story you've got to tell, or this is the story you need to zero in on this, or you need to reach for all that. I mean, teachers do that. You have ways of explaining to us what happened in an era, or what's happening with a particular set of people. You're putting the picture together, and there's a really exciting intellectual experience of being able to pull threads together, put pieces together, fit parts of a puzzle together, and make sense of it, first of all, for yourself. And then share that with other people. And I'm still on that now, but I've decided I've got to get to the point, not who stole the American dream, that is how we got in the problem. And by the way, that wasn't the title of the book that I signed a contract for. I signed a contract for a book that simply said The Dream at Risk, because in 2009, 2010, it was clear the dream was at risk. I only decided to call it Who Stole the Dream after 1.5 years of reporting and writing, and I concluded, no, this was the 1% and the powers that be, politically and economic, who were literally taking money and power away from the middle class very purposefully.
Well, I want you to, if you would talk a little bit about something that I think everybody here should know about, and maybe some do, but probably most don't. And that's what you talk about, I don't know whether it was a doctrine, a manifesto, a memo that Lewis Powell had written. Talk about that, because I don't think a lot of people know about that and how important you feel it has been in terms of what's going on?
I have to tell you, it's astonishing to me. That process of reporting for a year, almost every week I discovered something I didn't know about a story that I had sort of theoretically been covering for 30 years. I just kept finding things out. It was astonishing to me. You know, I'm pretty good at what I do, and to find out that there were really important things happening under the surface or that I didn't get. Maybe I saw it, maybe I recorded it, but I didn't get what it was really about. It was upsetting. And the Lewis Powell memo epitomizes that. When I ran the Washington Bureau in the late 70s, I had 65 reporters working for me, okay? Good reporters, working hard. None of us had ever heard during that period of the Lewis Powell memo, and yet it was a moving document at that time. Powell had been an important corporate attorney, so important and so well known he was elected president of the American Bar Association. So successful that eventually Richard Nixon in 1972 put him on the Supreme Court. So this is a pretty classy lawyer, right? He is also a very good friend of people at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He's an ardent believer in the free enterprise system. He is very anti-union. He's very anti-Ralph Nader and the consumer movement. He's very anti the women's movement, the movements I was just talking to you about that were so important to middle-class power in the 1960s and 70s. And he's telling his buddies at the Chamber of Commerce, look, we got to do something about politics. American business, he said American business is under mortal threat. He saw Walter Reuther as a greater danger to American capitalism than Soviet communism. And that was how extreme his views were at that point. And that's how worried he was. And so his buddies at the Chamber of Commerce said, why don't you, you're a lawyer, why don't you go write us a brief? So he sat down in August of 1971 and he wrote down what is now called the Lewis, to historians, it's called the Lewis Powell Memorandum of August 1971. And it was a manifesto for corporations and the financial elite to go grab power and politically capture Washington. Basically, he said, get organized, pool your resources, think of political action committees, lobbying money, spending on lobbying, spending on political campaigns, go after your enemies viciously, attack them the same way the trade unions do, run them out of town, take the high ground. It's all out there. In fact, I think it's the most important under-recognized political document in American history in the last half century, and so I persuaded Random House to print the text of it in the back of my book. So if you want to read it, it's there. It's a way to sell the books, you know, you get Powell going and that kind of stuff. I'm joking, but I really think it's that important. And what happened was astonishing. They listened to him. Within 4 months of Powell writing that memo, the Business Roundtable was formed. Now, the Business Roundtable is the most powerful voice of blue chip companies in America. We're talking DuPont, General Motors, General Electric, Microsoft, Apple, you name it. All the biggies are in there. And they're the CEOs. So when they go lobby in Washington, they don't go lobby your average congressman or congresswoman. They go stay in the Lincoln bedroom at the White House because they've given $200,000 or $2 million or whatever it is to whoever's president, or the vice president, or the Speaker of the House, or the Majority Leader of the Senate, or the committee chairman. They respond to Powell. At the time Powell wrote, there were 175 companies that had offices in Washington. Only 175. 8 years later, before Reagan is elected, there are 2,425. Boom! Unbelievable boom in Washington offices. The National Association of Manufacturers moves its headquarters to Washington. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce doubles its staff and triples its budget. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, which is the political arm of small business in America, had 3,000 members when Powell wrote his memo. 8 years later, 1979, 1980, it had 600,000. I mean, there's just an enormous political explosion. By the time Reagan's elected, there are 9,000 registered corporate lobbyists in Washington and 50,000 people working for business trade associations. There is a political army, and it changed the power equation in Washington, changed the landscape. I didn't know anything about it. I had never heard of the Lewis Powell memo. From the time I worked and ran the Washington Bureau, through all the years I did the documentaries, until I began to do the research on this book. And I found out from scholars. I didn't find out from other journalists. And Mark Shields, who was on, the Jim Lehrer show, PBS NewsHour Friday night, and writes a column for the Washington Post, gave a book party for me, and 60 or so of the leading Washington journalists, Bob Schieffer at CBS, and Shields himself, and Jim Lehrer, and all kinds of people are there. There was only one other correspondent in the room who had ever heard of the Lewis Powell memo. And this is what, 50 years later? I mean, it's amazing. So there's a lot that we don't know, and we have to kind of go back and work the territory. That's part of what really interested me about book writing, and part of what interested me about doing these long-form documentaries for PBS, because a 4-hour documentary series, and I've done a bunch of them, is like writing a book for television. There's a way in which you can get your hands around a subject and you go back through news that other people have covered, that you covered yourself, but you come back through it with a much fuller understanding of what happened. And we're not doing enough of that in American journalism today.
Just talking about that a little bit, being a reporter, being a book writer, now you're a documentary maker. How did you learn how to juxtapose the words with the pictures?
Well, that's another fascinating thing, I suppose. If you think of an artist, you learn to draw in black and white, and then you learn to paint color, paint with oils and that kind of stuff. I was lucky, having been on Washington Week in Review for a long time on PBS, and having been on Meet the Press and Face the Nation, so I was used to being around cameras. But it's very different to having the camera shoot at you, and then creating the whole story the camera's going to do, and then talking to that camera. You may think talking to that camera is simple, but persuading 2 million, 3 million, 5 million people out there, you're talking to them, you have to talk to that camera like it's your girlfriend. I mean, you really got to love that camera. You really got to want to communicate, and it is not natural. So that took me a while to learn how to do that. And then to learn how to walk and talk to the camera. I'm doing it now, but I'm freelancing. When you're doing it for a television documentary, you got to do it either on a script or very close to a script. But you got to make it look as though you're not on a script at all.
But you're in the edit suite? You're doing the editing?
No, you're walking around on the scene somewhere.
No, but somebody's editing what you've done, right?
Oh, what you do is you shoot, those are called stand-ups. When you do those, nobody's editing those. You've got to get it right.
But eventually...
Well, then it gets put into, then you're learning another art form, and it's just fascinating. I mean, I learned as a reporter, and what happens is you really learn in the edit room. What you learn in the edit room is all the stuff that you thought was really cool as a reporter, but it's not so cool. One of the things you learn to do is what you're doing to me tonight, asking very short questions, because the object is to get the other people doing the talking. And I'm game to do this because that's why I came here. But it's very important. And most print reporters will talk too much in an interview. But if you're doing an interview, and for example, you're trying to squeeze out of somebody at the White House what happened in the Iranian talks secretly, and you sort of dope out what you think happened, you can sort of say to somebody, isn't this what happened? And they squirm and so forth, and they don't want to admit it, and then you try the question 6 different ways till finally you get a concession that, in fact, you're on the right track. And you can write that. You can't use that on television because it's all the reporter talking. But you also learn how to do the reporter talking and then have the camera looking at the person at exactly the right moment. But you need to know how to ask the question exactly right.
Well, having spent most of my career doing TV commercials and ads and stuff like that, when I got in the edit suite, we always called it magic. Because you had all this stuff. Now you got to create something either in 30 or 60 seconds or a half an hour or something like that. And it's quite an exercise. And then to watch the technology of the editor,
right,
from 20 years ago to today,
right,
what they can do is just
astonishing. Yeah. I think the technology is very important, but I think the difference between ads and storytelling is important, because if you're going to do a documentary, what you have to have in a documentary of an hour is you have to have a significant discovery for your audience every 5 or 6 minutes. And you can't build a story like you hook up cars on a railroad train. And a lot of people think you can. You can't even write a book that way. Or like a bunch of elephants in a circle going around with each one holding the other one's tail in the trunk, right? That is not how you create a successful book. A book and a documentary have to be designed with a conceptual and storytelling architecture, the same way a house or a large building does. Each room has kind of got to make sense and lead to the next. The design's got to be similar enough, and the color scheme's got to be similar enough. I'm using metaphors here, obviously, so that it leads on. Now, maybe you got to do that in 30 or 60 seconds, but the time is so short that it has a terrible pressure of compression, and you can do more with magic. With a documentary, you really got to do it with both storytelling and discovery, and you really got to give people the feeling they're learning something new. And I mean, having won some awards, I've been asked to sit on juries, and I can tell you, I've seen a lot of documentaries that people think are really good, and by about 10 minutes, you're seeing the same story being told over and over again with different details in a different place, and the guys or the people who are putting it together think they've told you a great documentary, but in fact, mentally, you've turned off after a certain point because you're not learning more.
Something of a personal nature. You've been a reporter, you see your stuff in the New York Times, and after all the years you did it, that's not a big deal. You have an idea for a book, you write a book, you publish a book, and there is people buying it. Now, in the documentary part of your life, you have an idea, for a documentary. You go out and spend X amount of time researching it, shooting it, and all that. What kind of feeling do you have when it actually you give birth to it? It's going to appear on TV.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And there are several different things that you feel. Number one, you need to understand we shot about on a 50-to-1 ratio. Okay? For every minute we were going to put on the air, we shot 50 minutes. For every hour we were going to put on the air, we shot 50 hours. Okay? So you've got an enormous amount of material. And you have an idea, and you have an idea for a documentary, and you do reporting on it, and you refine the idea, and you change it. You change your idea of what that documentary is about, or the way you're going to tell that story, umpteen times in the process of doing it. Okay, so when you finally begin to get it organized and see it, and it works, and you can start to see it work the way I was just describing it from beginning to end, with these discoveries and little stories that are part of a bigger story and that fit together. You see it put together. I mean, it's like it is like an artistic achievement. I mean, you feel as though, wow, there's a piece of art. It's journalistic art, but there's a piece of art you put together. It's very, very different from a news report, which is a flat report where you're trying to focus on getting the highlights of the story out efficiently and effectively over a period of time. You are trying to take people in a documentary into a new world, or into a world they thought they knew, and give them a new understanding of it. When you see that, if it works, of course, after a while, you get blind to it the same way you get blind to your own children, right? But if you see it and it works, I mean, it's a thrill. It's just a thrill. I mean, but it's the same thing with a book, I mean, it's a big deal. And then the great thing about the documentary, and we did a documentary in Walmart. I didn't even mention it. We did a documentary as Walmart Good for America. That documentary has been shown on Frontline 5 times. Each time with the same size audience rating, about a 2.5, so something like 3 or 4 million people are seeing it each time. 5 times we're up to 15 to 17 million people. I haven't checked in the last 2 years, but over 1 million people have seen it online. It's having a real impact out there. Now, it's not there in solid print the same way a book is, but geez, I mean, I feel good selling 60,000 copies of a book, and 15 million people have seen the documentary on Walmart. I mean, it hasn't.
I got one more question, then we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions. You've won, I think, 2 Pulitzers.
I was part of a team that won a Pulitzer, and I won 1 Pulitzer myself.
Okay. Tell us what that's about. I mean, somebody nominates you, you nominate yourself. I mean, it's like the Academy Awards. How does it work?
No, you don't nominate yourself. Most of the time, you don't even know you're nominated. And now the nominations are known, but before they weren't. I mean, sometimes Neil Sheehan and I together broke the story that Westmoreland had asked for 206,000 more U.S. troops after the Tet Offensive in 1968. It turned out the New York Times nominated that for a Pulitzer, but we never knew it for years later. It didn't get the Pulitzer. And the only way at that time you knew was if you won or not. I didn't know anybody had nominated me for the reporting from Russia. With the Pentagon Papers, it's a bit different. I mean, it won a public service award. I mean, the Pentagon Papers, my God, we were publishing the secret history, the Pentagon secret history of the war. I mean, I have to tell you, I spent 3.5 months in a hotel room with Neil Sheehan. Neil Sheehan and I never once mentioned the word Pulitzer or ever thought about it. We just so goddamn busy reading 1 million words of top secret documents that we couldn't do it. So you don't think about that. But when you're done with it, the Pentagon Papers, when you're done with something like that, you can understand that the New York Times is probably going to nominate itself and its team for a public service award. So that's one you can imagine. But for individual, I mean, there's some just astonishing reporting going on around the world, and I think that if you think about that, you're going to go way off track. But it's not. I don't know. The New York Times is an institution of very talented people. Frontline, which wins a lot of Emmys, is an institution of very talented people. And there are many more Emmys given than there are Pulitzer Awards, Pulitzer Prizes. So if you do something, I mean, David Fanning would tell us if he was nominated, which he did a couple of times, 3 or 4 times, documentaries that I had done. So you know it, and either win it or you don't win it, but it's a kick, and if you go to the lunch and where the awards are given, but you're not thinking about that when you're doing the work.
Let's have some questions. Steve.
I'm wondering about the middle class. Why do you think the middle class is not acting in a way that you think that they should?
Well, I think there's several reasons. I think that people feel powerless. They look at the situation in Washington and they say the deck is stacked, politics are rigged, and they're rigged for the powerful and the wealthy, and I'm just an average person, and what can I do against that kind of army, against that kind of advantage? I have a friend in Texas named Ernie Cortez. He's a really important Latino organizer in the Southwest, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. And he said something profound. He said, power corrupts. Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. He said, powerlessness also corrupts. And I will add this, it corrupts democracy at the core. And I think that people have gotten passive, fearful, and fatalistic. And we've become a nation of complainers rather than a nation of actors. It's changing. There are people who are acting. One of the interesting things that I've discovered in the work that I've done since the book came out, and I'm now on the theme of what works, how do we reclaim the American dream? It's amazing what's been done. I don't know if you know what a public benefit corporation is, but a public benefit corporation is, by law, a company in which the CEO and the board does not have to focus on maximizing profits. The first public benefit law passed in America was by the state of Maryland in 2010. There are now 27 states that have public benefit laws, and there are 1,000 public benefit corporations in America now or more, and one of the larger ones floated an IPO on Wall Street last week. It's a huge development of people saying the kind of capitalism we have is not working right. 28 states have minimum wage laws that set a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage. Roughly 60% of the workforce in America works under those laws, which were originated locally, okay? 25 states have some form of public funding for elections. Now, most of them are very limited, either for judicial candidates or candidates for governor and attorney general. But there are 4 or 5 states that have pretty robust systems that cover the race for state legislature. And they've changed the political culture. And I could go on into other areas. And what I'm suggesting to you is that there are some issues that people are now beginning to seize at the state level. And this is and the city level. The city of Tallahassee in the last election passed an anti-corruption bill that was drafted by some of the smartest campaign lawyers in Washington, including a guy named Trevor Potter, who was John McCain's legal advisor in the drafting of the McCain-Feingold bill. He was a Republican, smart lawyer who believes in campaign reform. And they drafted a law which you can now pass in Akron or Toledo or Cincinnati or Hartford, Connecticut or Austin, Texas, or where have you. And it forces disclosure of all political campaign spending, not donations to candidates and parties, but all political spending, which is very important because it's the independent spending and the dark money that's skyrocketing, okay? It bans any donations by anybody who has business before the city government. In other words, if you're an electrical utility company, you can't donate $50,000 to a city councilman and then go to the city councilman and say, we want you to approve an increase in the electric utility rates, okay? And it does a number of other things. So people are starting to tackle this problem of money in politics. They're trying to tackle the problem of inequality of income. These public benefit corporations, you can consider the interest of your workers, of the environment, of your local community. You can legitimately, without fear of any lawsuit coming against you. In fact, the old incorporation laws probably permit that, but a lot of corporate lawyers contend they don't, and a lot of CEOs and boards are scared. Well, what I'm saying is there is a mood of reform that is afoot in the country. And what I'm trying to do, number one, as a reporter, is to get that news out to more people, because people don't have those facts. And if people start to understand other communities are doing something about the problems that we all feel acutely about, they'll be encouraged to try to do something themselves.
Other questions? Janice?
Along that line, sort of, do you think people might feel better if we had a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution?
I don't know if they heard that back there. She's asking me, do I think people might feel better if we had a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution? That's one of the subjects that's going to be on my website. There are 16 states that have now taken some action to push for a constitutional convention or at least an amendment to the Constitution, which will restore the power of Congress and state legislatures to regulate money in politics, okay? I think it's very important that this movement take place to signal to the politicians that we want that change. And it's coming from below, very much like the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and so forth. An actual constitutional convention is a very tricky thing, and there are legal arguments about whether or not, once one is called, whether or not it could be limited to the subject for which it was called, or it could rewrite the whole darn Constitution, in which case you might find the same people who have the political money and power dominating a convention, and you might wind up by getting a total boomerang. So I'm in favor of the movement, but more to put the pressure on the politicians to change than actually to have the convention. That's a sort of complicated notion. Yes?
What's going to result in the great number of corporate representatives in D.C. so that we aren't totally tied to them?
The question was, what's going to affect the total number of corporate representatives in D.C. so we're not tied to them by we? I guess you mean our government. At the moment, you should know, and there's a tendency for people to sort of equate management and labor and business and trade union interests. There are today 12,000 registered corporate lobbyists in Washington, and there are 400 for organized labor. 12,000 and 400. I mean, it's not even close to 50-50. And at one point, 30, 40 years ago, it was. And the number of consumer lobbyists is about 200. The number of environmental lobbyists is about 200. So it's very lopsided. I don't think there's any way we're going to be able to change that. You can't change that by law. That's like trying to regulate how water flows. But it seems to me the way to change that is to start operating in the states to try to get some of these other changes. And one I have not mentioned, which is terribly important, is gerrymandering. We all know about gerrymandering from our study of American history. Part of the problem is the term sort of is confusing and antiseptic and sounds like academic gobbledygook. What we need to do is to think of gerrymandered districts as political monopolies. What we have today is a Congress which is elected, 90% of which is elected in political monopoly districts. Either the Democrats or the Republicans have drawn the lines of the districts to make sure that their person wins and the other person doesn't. Now, sometimes that means that if you're a Republican governor of Ohio, and a Republican-dominated legislature of Ohio, you say there's no way we can carry Cuyahoga County. So let's jam as many people as we can into a couple of districts up in Cuyahoga County and concede those to the Democrats. But that's all they get. We're gonna carve up the outside of Columbus and attach it to a rural area. We're gonna carve up part of Akron, and we're gonna divide it up in ways so that in an area where if you looked at the demographics and you knew something about the people, it would be natural to either have a highly competitive district or a Democrat might emerge. But instead of that happening, what do you have from Akron right now? I understand you have
Four.
You have 4.
Used to have one.
Used to have 1. Well, that's partly population growth, but it's also the way the districts have been drawn to take part of Akron and attach it to the environs, another part. So the way the district lines are drawn is drawn to suit the sitting members of Congress, or the sitting members of the legislature, sitting members of Congress. We have to break that up. I mean, this is 90% of the House of Representatives is in political monopolies. Well, when we get angry at Washington for not paying attention to what we want out here in the country, and you got opinion polls telling people what they want on immigration, on tax law, on all kinds of stuff, you can find substantial majorities, excuse me. Congress doesn't do it. Well, one reason they don't do it is they're basically not listening to the middle class, but the basic reason they don't do it is because all these safe districts exist, and so they don't have to worry about getting voted out of office if they divide the voters. So the only way we can do it is to go back and empower ourselves and say, wait a second, we're not going to do this. Now, I'm told, you can tell me if I'm right, I get to ask you a question. I was told this morning that there is a move in the Ohio legislature to begin to consider a different redistricting plan for the state legislative offices and districts.
This is true, but keep in mind, if that passes, and there's ever an indication that it will, then it won't affect congressional districts until the 2022 election. Because the next census is in 2020, this law will go into effect of how the districts are drawn after 2020.
I'll take 22 over never.
Yeah.
I'll take it over never and then try to move it up. But I mean, thank God. I want to tell you, lots of states where I go, people say, well, it's only 2015. Why should we do that? The next census is until 2020, and we can deal with it later. The answer is no. If you wait until later, you won't have enough time to actually get the stuff passed. So if that's actually happening, that's good. Now, can I find out something about that? Can I get information on that?
I'll get it to you.
Will you? Because that's important to me. I'm trying to follow this stuff. Gerrymandering is not on the website that I've brought out at this point, but it's our next subject.
Tell them where to find your website.
The website will come live later this month. It's called Reclaim the American Dream. No capital letters, no dashes, no period. ReclaimTheAmericanDream.org. And it's intended for you. It's nonprofit, it's nonpartisan. We're not trying to raise money, and we're not interested in just one issue. I call it a gateway website. We don't have a pet issue. We got a whole bunch of issues. You pick the issue you want to get involved in. You got a list of readings. You got a list of organizations. You got success stories. You got progress reports. You got maps of the country. You got all kinds of stuff. It's a journalistic website.
I have a question about Dottie.
Yeah, I've been sitting back here crying because you took me through the whole civil rights thing. You took me through Vietnam. You and I are about the same age, okay? I want you to tell me the kids who are in my class, I'm one of the slow learners, get their ass out and work. Okay?
Yeah, well, when I tell that story about Martin Luther King, I actually stumbled into this. I was asked to give a speech at the Pearl, which is an old church in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which used to be at the end of the Underground Railway. And Martin Luther King spoke there. And I was asked to speak there on Martin Luther King Day, not this year, but a year ago. And I got talking about Martin Luther King, some of the comments I made today, and then I told the story about Martin Luther King and being an outside agitator, and said, yes, I am an agitator. I'm agitating to make change and knock the dirt out of the society. And my final line in that speech, and my line to you guys today is, we need a new generation of agitators. We need to turn ourselves into agitators. It's absolutely critical. In this, I'm not giving you a comment that's academic. We're sitting in an academic setting. We're sponsored here by Ray Bliss Institute. He was a great politician and an important figure. I'm talking about your lives. Today's students are facing 50 years ahead of inequality, of a political system that doesn't work, of meager job prospects, of an America that's losing its competitiveness if we don't change it. I'm ready to work with you, and so is she ready to work with you. We need to get your generation. I'm trying to encourage, and I'm actually speaking at Amherst College next in a couple of weeks to a group of Amherst alumni who've decided to form an alliance with the current senior class at Amherst College, so the two generations are going to get together and to push for reform. And so tonight, what's your name? Yeah.
I'll give you my card.
No, I want to know your name. Dottie. All right, your name is Dottie, and what's the name of the young woman sitting in front of you? You.
What's your name?
You.
You. I'm Brittany Madison.
What?
Brittany Madison.
Brittany. Dottie and Brittany Madison are announcing tonight that they are the co-chairs, and I'm serious, they're the co-chairs of the Akron Citizen Action Committee, started tonight. Okay? And I'm joking about that. I'm joking about that, but I'm serious. I was speaking at a group in Seattle, and somebody got up and said to me about halfway through the question period, where's the new leadership going to come from? And I told him that story about it comes from below. And I asked the guy his name, and he told me his name. His name was Ben, and I said, Ben, you're it. You're the chairman right here in this building. And you better get the woman who organized this event, because she's a pretty good organizer, to be your co-chairman. And everybody laughed, and I said, I know it's funny, but it's real. An hour later, I left the building with my wife, and Ben met me in the lobby, and he had a clipboard. He said, I got 9 names on my committee. Okay? That's what has to happen. That's the answer to your question. That's what has to happen. Okay? Dottie, you and your friend have got to get together and actually do it.
They're my classmates.
Yeah, great.
Could you see yourself being a foreign correspondent in Moscow now under Putin in light of the Forbes correspondent? I think it was the head of the magazine was killed.
Yeah.
Could you,
Yes, I could see myself doing the job. The guy who was head of Forbes there was not the only one. Anna Politskaya, there was just a whole
unofficially there's been 140
Is that right?
people killed.
Yeah, well, but the number of journalists is staggering. And there's no question that the regime is behind at least some, if not most of those killings. Yeah, I could see myself doing that. I think we have to fly the flag. I think we have to do it. I think we have to not be intimidated. But would I be scared? Would I be worried about it? Would I be watching people who are walking behind me? Sure. But I have to tell you, I've been scared in this country. I mean, when I was covering civil rights, I was in Birmingham, sleeping in my hotel after having covered some demonstrations. And I went to bed, and I got a call from the New York Times national desk at about 1:30 in the morning. And they said, there's been something terrible that's happened in Gadsden, which is about 30, 40 miles north of Birmingham. There's been violence, people have been hurt. I knew there'd been a demonstration there for a while. There'd been a sit-in on the courthouse lawn by people who wanted voting rights and that kind of stuff. This is 63, so this is well before Selma. And can you get up there, they said, and get us a story before the last edition? This is back to your question about whether or not I was reading the paper. This is the 3 a.m. deadline. So I got dressed, and I drove up to Gadsden. And I'd been to Gadsden before, and when I got to the courthouse square, there were papers littered all over the place. That here and there I saw some signs of blood, not much, but it was clear there'd been some kind of a mess. And so I headed for the offices of a couple of black doctors that I knew. And sure enough, there were a bunch of people getting their heads bandaged and arms, put in a sling and that kind of stuff. And I stayed up most of the night, and then I filed a story. I'm sure the only people that ever read it was either the people at the desk in New York or the public library. This is the last edition. I didn't file much because I didn't have that much. But the next morning, a whole bunch of people had been arrested. The next morning, I went to the sheriff's office at about 7 o'clock. And I went to the sheriff's blotter, and I was writing down the names of the blacks who'd been arrested. And what I found out was that the sheriff's office and the police had been through the crowd of demonstrators, and they'd been clubbing them in the head with billy clubs. Really brutally beating them up, kicking them, and that kind of stuff. And I was there writing in the blotter, and who walks in but Al Lingo, commander of the Alabama State Highway Patrol. And he comes striding in with a couple of guys behind him, and he goes to a swinging door and into the back and into the sheriff's office. And he turns around, and he comes back, and he said, I knew him by this time. He said, Smith? He said, where are your buddies? I said, what do you mean? He said, you didn't make the mistake of coming up here alone, did you? And I said, no, they're around the corner. There was nobody there. They're around the corner. They just, one was in the bathroom getting a leak, and he said, you don't ever want to come up to a place like this alone. You got me? And he walks into the sheriff's office. I was scared. I was scared. I covered a couple of situations in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. Do you know what Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana is? Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana is bayou country. You're down in the bayous. And I was down there, I was pursuing, this is during one of the summers when I was covering civil rights, and I was fascinated because down there they had a triple layer segregation system. They had blacks, mulattoes, and whites. They had 3 different school systems, and the seating in theaters, everything was 3-3-3. And I thought that was an interesting story. And I actually filed it. Turner Catlett, the managing editor of the New York Times, sent me a special message and an award for doing that story. But what I realized was I was the only out-of-town person walking around that town for a couple of days. And people were looking at me and watching me. And I'd been in situations where cops and other people had poured sand down the gas tanks of our rented cars so you couldn't run your car, so you could get trapped, and then who knew what would happen after that. Bayou country is country where people disappear. I mean, there are any number of deaths where people disappeared there. So there have been times, there's times when in Russia when I was very scared, but there are times in America when I've been scared as a reporter.
Okay, one last question.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
With the changes in media and journalism now, you've been born 50 years later, would you have gone into journalism, and do you think you would have been as successful?
I don't have any idea. I mean, I think I'd have gone into journalism because I don't think, you have to understand, I left a college where nobody went into journalism. No, I came out near the top of my class at Williams College, and people went to Harvard Law School and medical school and Wall Street. So there were maybe 3 of us that went into journalism, okay? So, and I didn't do it because I thought the job was going to lead to great success. I did it because it's what I wanted to do. I was just fascinated with the idea. So I think the answer to the first question is yes, I'd have done it again. I don't know how success is going to be measured in the next 30 or 40 years. I mean, are there going to be books? Is somebody going to have an opportunity to do what I've had an opportunity to do? I mean, I've been extraordinarily lucky. I've been extraordinarily fortunate. I think a paper like a news organization like the New York Times is going to continue to exist. Whether or not it exists as a printed paper where the news is delivered to you in something you hold in your hand, or it's delivered to you on your iPhone, or it's delivered to you electronically, people are going to continue to value news organizations because it takes news organizations to actually look at the world and try to match up all the different things that are happening in medicine, in Ukraine, in Hollywood, I mean, all the different worlds there are in the world. And give you a news product that says these are things that happen, or that not just happen, but that we've discovered in the last day, week, month that we want to put in front of you. And having trained reporters, trained editors, doing that kind of seeking the news, sifting the news, evaluating the news, and putting it out to you is going to be valuable, certainly to the intellectual elite and the social elite and probably the financial elite of this country and this world for as long as we can imagine. How it's going to be delivered, I don't know. So I mean, I had a wonderful career as a print newspaper reporter, then I had a 20-year career as a documentary producer, and I've written 8 books or parts of 8 books. I don't know, is that going to happen again? No, but who knows? There may be some other thing that will come up that will turn out to be fascinating. I think that we have to think of ourselves as intellectual entrepreneurs. We have this notion that being an entrepreneur has something to do with business. It does. but it has something to do with teaching. It has something to do with medicine. It has something to do with journalism. It has something to do with changing society. The entrepreneurial spirit is the spirit of trying to invent something new or find a new way to generate and look at what we've been seeing before. And so I think the opportunity for that is going to exist. You know, would I be able to be lucky enough to cash on it as well as I have in the past? I don't have any idea, but it's worth a try. I have to tell you, the last thing I would say to you is I just had a wonderful time doing what I've done.